like this, we're really just going to be able to kind of bring up some of the main points, get your thinking, get your input, and hopefully lead you to have greater awareness as you go forward and seek out more information on these relevant topics. From Dan and my perspective, there's probably nothing more important than a topic than education in America. And today, the topic focuses on the rising cost of higher education, which is very relevant as we see tuitions increasing, students graduating with more student debt than ever before, with a difficult job market. So it's one of the most challenging times right now in America. And of course, there are differences between public colleges and private universities, although there's similarities. And today you're going to hear from a great group of people, two remarkable students from our public policy school. We have one of the leaders of the Cal State system, and we have the leader of the Campaign for College Opportunity with us today. So enjoy the discussion, and I toss it over to you, Dan Schnur.
And thanks to all of you for attending. As Bonnie said, from a pure self-interest standpoint, this is something that obviously we're very glad that you've come to hear about today. And as Bonnie mentioned, we're particularly happy to have been able to put together such a tremendous panel for you. For discussion will begin in just one moment. In addition to our panelists, I'm joined, as we are every week, by one of the editors of the Daily Trojan, who joins us as co-moderator. Today we're lucky to have Daniel Rothberg, the former editor-in-chief and now special projects editor of the Daily Trojan. He'll be joining me in the questioning. But we're really, really excited about our panel because I think you're going to be really, really impressed by what you hear. And so let me take a minute just to introduce them to you, and then we'll get started. Sitting directly to my right is Michele Siqueiros, and Michele is the executive director for the Los Angeles office of the Campaign for College Opportunity. And prior to that, she's the senior project coordinator for the Department of Neighborhood Empowerment for the City of Los Angeles, and is a founding program manager for Public Allies of LA, and a former commissioner on the California Student Aid Commission. Michele, thanks so much for being here. We appreciate it. Skip over Taylor for just a second, because sitting 2 chairs down from Michele is Lisa Chavez. And Lisa is currently the Vice President for Administration and the Chief Financial Officer for California State University of Los Angeles. She's a board member for CSU LA, and she has held senior positions at several CSU locations, including Dominguez Hills, San Marcos, and the Office of the Chancellor. Both she and Michele are two of the state's foremost experts in the question not only of higher education, but higher education affordability. Lisa, we're very glad to have you here. Thank you so much for coming. And as I think those of you who come to our programs in the past know, that we have a rule for our student talkback programs, that we won't do any programming unless it includes students, not only as audience members, but as participants in the conversation. And we're really, really lucky today to have both Megan Baaske, who's a former student of mine, and she's now getting her master's in public policy over at the Price School, and Taylor Wolfson, who is a future student of mine, who is an undergrad at the Price School. Megan, Taylor, we're really glad you guys are here. Thanks very much. Daniel, why don't you get the questioning started? How about that?
Okay, great. So I think I'm gonna start with a question for Megan. It's no surprise that costs have been rising at universities throughout the country for several years now. I was wondering if you could give us a little bit of background on how costs have been rising and sort of the different stories that play out at different types of universities throughout the country.
Absolutely. So it's really important not to kind of look at all the universities and colleges with one kind of looking for one cause. There are several, and for instance, for public universities, it's really a question of a decrease in state funding. The CSU system, the UC system, and the community colleges in California have seen a significant decrease in the amount of funding from the state, and so in order to kind of bridge that gap, they've had to increase tuition as a result. Private universities, while perhaps losing some funding due to the recession, are really a different story. And they just have seen costs increase, both costs for instruction as well as student services as well as research over the past several years. So there are really two different stories going on, and probably will require two different solutions for each of them.
Lisa, we're going to come to you next because we want to talk about college affordability. And normally, and we'll get to this subject in a second, you tend to think of those young people who come from lower income families and communities. But one of the things that you're seeing particularly at CSU, but across the higher education field, is a very, very significant challenge for middle class students and their families. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that particular challenge.
Well, in the CSU 15 years ago, the tuition was $714 a semester to go to school. Now it's $2,600, and we're still one of the most affordable solutions in the whole entire country. But what happens is, as the price of all of these institutions are going up, the middle class is having to use that dollar more wisely, or try to find a cheaper alternative when they can't afford the tuition. A full price college will, like here it's what, $44,000 a year for the tuition, which a middle class, especially faced with the downturn in the economy, and some people who had money set aside for their children's education in investments, they took big losses. So now they're trying to find a cheaper alternative for students. And so even at the CSU, it's difficult because we're being squeezed because of access, and the middle class really is getting stuck in the middle. They can't afford the more expensive institutions because they're not eligible for all the financial aid, and the cheaper alternatives like community college, for example, is so overcrowded that you can't get the classes you need. So I think the middle class in particular is really suffering. As the costs have gone up, the amount of aid hasn't equaled the amount of rising costs. So even the poorest students have to work and provide more support for those, for their education. So I think it's very difficult.
I want to ask Michele also, in addition to the challenges that many middle-class students face in funding higher education, what are some of the challenges that lower-income students face? And I was wondering if you could just tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. Well, across the country, we see that low-income students in general have huge sticker price shock. So a lot of times, Taylor mentioned this earlier, there's not enough information for students in general around what aid is available, what financial aid they may qualify for. So we tend to think that there's a lot of aid on the table for low-income students, but low-income students actually don't tend to know that that aid is available. We also see that it's way more probable that a C student that is, upper income will go to college when compared to an A student who is low income. We also see that there's huge undermatching. So undermatching is kind of this new phenomenon that's being written about, where low-income students that are really the best of the best end up going to less selective institutions, often because they don't even think to apply to a USC, a Stanford, or a UC, or a Cal State, for which they could be eligible for. They tend to enroll at community colleges in heavy numbers. And so there's a lot of information challenges, and still a huge gap in terms of how we're not serving and encouraging low-income students who are quite capable to actually go to college.
And in just a minute, I want to bring Taylor into this conversation also to talk about a lack of information or lack of awareness among high school students making these plans. But before I do, Taylor, if I can just ask Michele a quick follow-up question. Because Michele, one of the things that you've told us about previously is a report that the Campaign for College Opportunity is preparing and getting ready to release, more specifically on the question of challenges facing Latino and Latina college students or prospective college students in terms of affordability and access. And maybe you can tell us a minute about that report and what you found.
Yeah, so in a couple weeks, on November 5th, we'll be releasing the first in a series of research documents around the state of higher ed in California. And the first one will be about Latinos in higher education. And just really kind of highlighting how important our collective future is. It isn't just about more Latinos going to college and why that's good for them, but really just understanding that given the demographic changes in California, the very reality that 38% of our current population is already Latino, and that 1 in 2 kids under 18 are Latino, that means that in less than 40 years, Latinos will be the majority in the state, and yet they have the lowest levels of educational attainment. So only 11% of the adult population that's Latino has a bachelor's degree. We, in spite of huge college-going numbers, so that was a big story earlier this year. The Pew Hispanic Trust released this report that Latinos are going to college in greater numbers than even white students across the country. But my real concern is that they're not completing once they go. And if they're going, they're mostly going to community college, where we know they're definitely not completing once they go. So the report will share a lot of findings in terms of kind of what is the state of educational attainment, but also what are some of the challenges, and why should policymakers and the rest of the state and the country care about it, even if you're not Latino.
And we want to talk in just a few minutes about the role for policymakers, both at the state and the national level, in terms of college access and affordability. But before we do, I want to get to an even more basic question, Taylor, that Michele mentioned briefly. And I think one of the things that you found in your research is not so much among college students, but among high school students applying and getting ready to apply for college, a real lack of awareness and lack of understanding of the options that might be available to them. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about what you found.
Sure. So I came across a report by America's Promise Alliance that found very obvious, but maybe hidden things that we really don't think about. The fact that a lot of students, when they're applying to college, their main goal is simply to apply and to get in, and unfortunately, financial aid becomes an afterthought, and they're simply not prepared for that once they've already gotten into these colleges. And if they had simply thought about it beforehand, this is something that they could have taken into consideration. As for high school students being able to prepare, the study found that increasing financial literacy, making the financial aid application easier for students, giving them more kind of college preparedness courses in these areas are very simple but effective tools that would be able to help college students prepare in not only to apply to these colleges academically, but financially as well.
And to follow up on that, I want to ask Lisa, from your experience, where can some of these students who are applying to college and high school go for information on financial aid?
Well, you can, the federal government has, you fill out a FAFSA, and there is information there. But also, we as a system, the CSU does a lot of outreach. We do Super Sundays where we reach out to the African American population and provide access and ways for them to go to college, and actually educate the parents on how they can get their students into college. And we provide posters to all of the counselors in the high schools, and we reach out to all the high schools, and we actually have a very aggressive outreach program so that all of our feeder high schools get information. But once again, it's the students have to be aware that we're on the campus and we're there to help them. And I think that that's where the disconnect happens, because students make that assumption they're going to go to school, and they just really don't pay attention and do their look at what their grades are, where they should go, and really pay attention. And sometimes it has to do with whether you have a mentor at home or a friend or somebody that can help you do that. If your parents haven't gone, you're a first-generation college student going, you don't have that help at home that you probably would get if your parents already have an education. And I think that's one of the problems, is the first-generation students really don't have the support mechanisms that they need.
And I want to take the conversation in a slightly different direction and come back to you, Megan. You were talking earlier about the ever-rising costs of a college education, whether at a public or private school across the board. I know one of the things that you've been looking into is not just the reasons for those rising costs, but why isn't somebody doing something to try to keep those costs more under control? I would think that a college or university system would have a great incentive to devote a lot of time and effort to thinking about ways to keep costs down. but that doesn't seem to be happening. What have you found?
Well, I don't want to say that no institution is looking at the bottom line. Community colleges, for instance, actually spend less per student than they did 10 years ago. So there are some changes being made, but across the board, there hasn't been much progress. And one of the reasons is there really aren't very many incentives from an institution's perspective to keep those costs low. Despite the fact that USC costs now $45,000 in tuition alone, which is a significant increase over what it was when I started as a freshman 10 years ago. There are still students, they're still paying those costs, and USC is still it's working. They're not seeing a decrease in enrollment as a result of that. So there really isn't a kind of pressure on the supply side of college institutions to reduce those costs. So one of the things that the Obama administration has proposed is to kind of link financial aid with college affordability in a number of ways. And perhaps that, amongst other ideas, will actually create incentives for institutions to make that a priority.
I want to sort of expand on that and go to Michele with this question. What are policymakers looking at right now in terms of solutions for curbing the cost of higher education and sort of hitting on some of the incentives that Megan was discussing?
Well, in California last year, or this last legislative year, the legislature passed the middle class scholarship, and I think that was in direct response to sort of this sense that middle class students are being priced out, and we need to do more to help facilitate them going to college. The middle class scholarship is only, though, for students at the UC and the CSU, and really is what I would call, and Lisa, maybe you have other thoughts, is really a kind of tuition. Whereas the legislature used to say, okay, we're going to actually roll back tuition, help you roll back tuition by giving you more money. This way, the legislature did it more indirectly by saying we're going to set up a scholarship program that essentially rolls back tuition to give more money. So that's one solution. I mean, there's, I think, a lot on the table around Cal Grant reform in California. There were dozens of bills introduced last year. Very few actually passed to improve or expand aid for low-income and middle-income students. I don't think this conversation is going to go away. I think everybody's talking about college affordability. I think students are organized around college affordability and student loans. And nationally, I think there's some good pieces out there. So Bonnie mentioned, as we were preparing, talk about some of the good stuff. I think some of what's good about the president's plan is income-based repayment. The idea that, students that take on loans will know that their payment after they graduate from college will be capped at about 10 or 15%, depending on which income-based program you enroll in. How many of you knew that that was an option for you once you graduate? One person. So that's 3 people. That's the problem with income-based repayment, is that folks don't really know about it, and we would love to see it be automatic. I mean, why shouldn't students just automatically be enrolled in an income-based repayment so that you know that your loans would be affordable? So those are some of the possibilities out there.
Perhaps, Michele, the federal government could set up a website that provided information both on healthcare and on college affordability.
There is a website which apparently doesn't have very many glitches. So I would definitely encourage you to go to the Department of Ed website. On the student loan side, I don't think they're having problems.
It's a totally unfair point. Hey, Lisa, Michele gave you a very nice setup, and I'm wondering if, in addition to the points that she made, if there's anything else that you see either happening or having happened at the state or national level in terms of policy change to provide some necessary steps forward.
Well, there's always this debate that happens, that is education a public good or is that a private good? So, that depending on which side you fall on that argument, you either are supportive of everybody getting educated to the extent that they're capable of getting an education and the state or the government should fund it. And then you have the other side that said everybody should pay as they go, and it's only for their own private benefit that they go to school. And I think that debate continues on, and the funding, I think, gets flip-flopped between those two. conversations. And what happens at the state level for CSU, UC, and community college funding is we are really, as they've carved out everything with Prop 98, and they've carved out all of these parts of the budget, we really are in like this little part of the budget that we, when we're going up to ask for money, we're really arguing against welfare and prison funding. And so it makes it really difficult when we're trying to make our point about how we need to educate all of these people, and some people in the room think it's a private benefit, and some people think it's a public good. So just educating the legislature on how important it is to have an educated society and where we need to be, because if you look at the information, we need to have much more educated population for all of the technical jobs that we're going to have in 15 years, and the only way that we're going to get there is to educate our population. So I would say that it should be looked at as a public good, because otherwise we're going to have to import people from other countries and other places to fill those jobs. So I think that that's one thing that the legislature needs to understand, that it really is a public good.
Hey, and Taylor, one particular aspect of the public policy discussion has really fascinated me, and that's the increased number of international students who many public universities, most notably the UC system, has reached out to. And it seems to me that, logically speaking, an international student body like we have here at USC brings all sorts of benefits. Brings all sorts of benefits in terms of diversity, in terms of exposing students to different backgrounds and different cultures and different opportunities, and certainly making an aggressive effort to enroll students from other parts of the world into our public universities has obvious benefits as well. But it's more complicated than that, isn't it? Maybe you can talk about why this particular topic has become such a controversial one.
Sure. As you said, I personally had thought the purpose of bringing in international students was only for diversity, but it turns out there's a much more hidden monetary reason for a lot of these. And I found that at universities across the United States, but in particular, I found that at the University of Washington, they now have 18% of an international population, which is a very large increase from what they had in the recent past. And
just to interrupt for a second, and that's because an international student will pay a higher tuition rate.
Exactly. So they say that the international students are willing to pay 3 to 4 times more, and it's their tuition that's essentially bringing in a lot of these low-income in-state students. I also found that a lot of universities are actually paying for agents to go and find international students to bring. So it's not only that these students are interested, but it appears that a lot of universities are going out of their way to find these students and kind of pique their interest. So not only are we trying to bring in these to have these students come, but we're trying to find them and go out of our way to find them. But the question is, how long can we kind of sustain the system? We have so many more students that are continuing to go to college every year. Can we continue to make these spots for the students? Can we, for these international students, can we continue to have them pay and try to foot the bill for these other students, American students, who cannot pay?
And this strikes me as a really, really difficult question, and so therefore I'll put it to the rest of our panelists. So for Lisa, Michele, Megan, any or all of you who'd like to weigh in, on one hand, there are extraordinary benefits that come from that sort of diversity. On the other hand, at least a couple of you have talked also about questions of access. And if you make that much of an effort to bring in students from other parts of the world, the types of students that you were talking about, Michele, who might have less access, and that you were talking about, Lisa, won't have opportunities that might be available to them. Can you square that circle?
So I would just say that, there's a real public benefit, right? The economic investment that the state makes in sending more of us to college is a big return for them, because the more money we all make, the more taxes we pay. And the less likely it is that we're going to be incarcerated or their social services expenditures will happen for us. So that's just the bottom line economics. And what we find is that other states aren't just recruiting other international students, but they're also actually recruiting Californians. And they're recruiting Californians because we have a capacity challenge. We're not serving as many students as are eligible, but also because they're hoping those California students aren't going to come back to California. And so there is a very real possibility, not only are we not educating enough of our own people, and we have a lot of people to educate, but there are other states that actually don't have enough people to educate. And so, there's, I think, this growing competition around like educated folks. I mean, part of what has made California stellar, Silicon Valley great, the biotech industry in San Diego fantastic, is education and the human capital that we bring to it. So I think those are just very key realities. I also just wanted to share two things around your earlier question about policymakers, because there have been a couple of real big game changers on the policy front. One is that the governor, when he passed the budget and increased funding for UC and CSU, he made it very clear that that funding increase would only happen if they did not raise tuition. And so to your earlier point, right, Megan, around how do you control it, there's a lever to control that with, right? And then last year, the legislature actually passed restrictions on Cal Grants by saying that colleges actually have to meet Cal Grant eligibility. So usually we think of Cal Grant as a student is eligible either by their income or not. But the state actually said, you know what, we're actually not satisfied with the completion, graduation rate, and student loan default rate at for-profit colleges in California. So we're going to stop giving state aid to students that go to those colleges and universities. Hugely controversial, and probably only passed because there were budget cuts that had to be made in 2011. But as a California Student Aid Commissioner, that's a way to use policy to really direct resources to institutions that are doing a better job. And most of the institutions that were cut out of Cal Grant eligibility were for-profit colleges that had less than a 30% graduation rate and more than a 15% cohort loan default rate, meaning that more than 15% of their graduates actually are defaulting on student loans. So there are real good policy ways to impact. I would say that on the governor's budget piece, the thing I struggle with the most is that there's a very real challenge that UC, CSU, and community colleges face when they do have to hold tuition flat, which is around access, right? So that if you're not getting more tuition revenue, then you could be serving more students, but there's no revenue, and now you've been told you definitely can't raise revenue. And so I think that the art is in the balance, because at the end of the day, we do want to provide more access, and sometimes policies can restrict that.
Lisa, I'd say probably three big policy points that Michele raised, any one of which could easily take us through the rest of the hour. Anything in particular from your perspective at CSU that leaps out for the good or the bad in terms of the steps that our policymakers in Sacramento have been taking?
Well, the funding from the state was cut almost $800 million over the last 5 years, and some of that was provided by tuition increases. But I don't know if you all are aware, in the CSU, when 1/3 of all of the tuition that's collected from students is turned around and given out as financial aid. So really, when we have a $300 million tuition increase, it's really only a $200 million increase, because we're actually taking 1/3 of that and setting it aside for financial aid. So as the cost of the tuition goes up, we are in fact having to provide more financial aid for a 1/3 of the students to help offset it. So it becomes, for every dollar that they cut out of the general fund, we really have to raise a little more than $1, because we have to set 1/3 of it aside. So it becomes, this public image problem, because we really aren't getting back every dollar that we're cut in when we raise the tuition. And I don't think that gets publicized or made aware of to the general public. So we always end up looking like the bad guys, when in fact we actually have taken less money over the last 6 years to try to provide the same amount of access to the same number of students. So it becomes difficult. It becomes a PR kind of issue, and then they say, oh, look, they raised the tuition. Well, the offset was that they took away the money and they used it for some other part of the budget, or they just took the cut for the good of the state. So, and as I've looked at, I actually tracked this, and I looked at the cost of the prisons, because I just like to pick on the prisons. And, their costs have gone up like this, where the CSU's percentage of the general fund has gone down. So really what they've done is given the prison what they would have given the system. So I see that as a problem, but no one, that doesn't ever come to the forefront as an issue.
I will call that the most polite criticism of state government that I have ever heard. Very, very nicely. Let's do this. We're just about halfway through the program, and as we do every week, at this point, we'd like to broaden the discussion. Daniel and I have monopolized it long enough, and so now we'd like to bring in any of you into the conversation, any of you who may have questions. And just a couple of quick reminders, as we do every week. Number one, just a reminder that if you do have a question, when we call on you, before you ask your question, let us know who you are. Tell us your name so we know who's participating in the discussion. And then second, if you have a question of one of the panelists with whom you've disagreed, remember that somebody with whom you disagree is not your enemy. They're not dumb and they're not evil. They're a really smart person who happens to have just come to a different conclusion about a really difficult issue than you have. And so we'd ask that you frame that question with the same level of respect and regard that you would hope that they would show for you if they were questioning you on a point of disagreement. So with those two reminders, let's open it up. Who has questions for our panelists? Yes.
My name is Kristen. My question, I guess, is kind of for anyone. I know, Lisa, you mentioned that a lot of classes or less classes are available at community colleges. And I know we read about that all the time. Students not only not finishing their associate's degree, but also not transferring to four-year universities and all the troubles with registration. What would be the solution to that when there is just this massive influx at community colleges? What kind of policies should the state look at for fixing that? Is it more community colleges, more classes at the current ones? How do you go about fixing that?
Great question for anyone who'd like to take a shot at it. Lisa, and it looks like Michele would like to weigh in also, and that's great.
Well, I think, one of the issues is the funding. So if we had unlimited funding, everybody could attend and they could go and take as many classes as they want. And unfortunately, there isn't the funding. They have raised the tuition. Now it's $46 a unit. It used to be $12 a unit about 15 years ago. And if you look at it, we're the cheapest educational institution in the country. Nobody else charges $46 a unit. And so with that comes access for everybody, and it's like everybody wants to go to the store and buy something, but there's not enough stuff on the shelves. So you either have to build a bigger store so that everybody can go into the store, or you have to start providing limitations, like saying, okay, first-time freshmen that are going to transfer should have highest priority for registration because they are the ones that are going to go on. What about the vocational students, the ones that are getting vocational training so that they can go become x-ray techs? Then what do you do about them? Okay, they need to go there too, so you're going to have to make access for them. And then you have the third component, which is personal enrichment. I'm going there because I want to learn how to do photography, or I want to learn how to do, I want to speak Spanish, or I want to do something that's just a personal enrichment. So you then have to decide with policy what things you're going to decide to eliminate, because you can't provide it for everyone unless you provide more funding. So I think that's where you're stuck. It's extremely cheap per student right now what the community college provides. It's just there's not enough access for everybody that wants to go.
Michele, if I can ask you a more specific follow-up, and if there are other things you want to say, by all means, we'll make sure you have the time to. But on this topic of community college access, there was a very, very interesting piece of legislation introduced this year by Assemblyman Das Williams from Santa Barbara. And what Assemblymember Williams' legislation suggested is that because access to required classes had become so difficult, that students who were in a position to do so could pay a significantly higher per unit fee than the $46 and therefore get presidents to get into those classes. Some people, including obviously Mr. Williams, said that was a very good idea, because that way if you're a community college student and you need those credits to transfer to a CSU or a UC or to a private university, that gives you a chance to get them. His opponents argued that it was a horrible idea because it undermined the idea of affordable education by pricing out those students who wouldn't be able to afford it. Your thoughts on this?
You know, I think that too often we think about cost as just whatever the tuition or the per unit fee is, and that's not what cost is for students. You know, cost is when it takes you an extra year to get a class that you can't have, there's a real cost to that. And so we were very supportive of the Assemblyman's legislation. It's not perfect, it's really just a pilot. It's going to only allow a few community colleges to offer these high demand impacted courses essentially at what it costs them so that they can bring in more students. We did push them to make sure that there was set aside for low-income students so that it wasn't just accessible to those that have money. And they did incorporate that in the legislation, which Governor Brown signed. So we do think we have to be more thoughtful about what our solutions, tuition can't be the only thing that we're talking about. Community colleges are significantly underfunded when compared to CSU and UC in terms of per pupil. They get about $5,500 by the state. And actually, that's not far from what the average is nationally. But other community colleges in other states have more revenue because their fees are much higher. Our fees, we sort of have this value that access is the most important thing. Well, if you're not offering courses, you're not offering access either. And if you're not offering access within a reasonable amount of time, then that's not good for students either. So I would say that, it's about time that we figure out other solutions. More money is absolutely important, but more money isn't going to rain down on the system anytime soon. And then just to also answer your question, we were very active on reforming transfer in California. In fact, Bonnie Reese, when she was with Governor Schwarzenegger, was a big advocate. In fact, we signed historic legislation in 2010 by Governor Schwarzenegger, carried by Senator Alex Padilla, to create a really clear associate degree for transfer pathway from community colleges to the CSU that would guarantee students 60 units at the community college and a degree, guarantee them 60 units at the CSU with guaranteed admission as juniors, because the transfer rate right now in California is 25%. That's how many students in California community colleges end up transferring. And many of them don't even get a degree, even though maybe they spent 4 or 5 years at a community college. And so if they don't end up getting that BA, then they've spent 4 or 5 years and have nothing to show for it. And so that's been pretty historic. We followed up with legislation that was just signed by Governor Brown to set clear deadlines, because what we saw was that community colleges across the state were not implementing the legislation evenly. So if you lived in Sacramento or Long Beach or San Diego, you're going to have a lot of associate degree for transfer options. But if you live in LA, guess what? We have the worst in terms of participation rates by our local community colleges. And, we just have to keep pushing. So yes, let's advocate for more funding, but there are things that colleges can do better and more effectively to also serve our students. I always say, students, it's sort of high stakes. You have to, if you're in a class, you have to get an A, and if you don't, then you're done, right? I think it's time that colleges actually have to also step up and be accountable for making sure that they're serving students better.
About what happened with both Governor Schwarzenegger and Brown, but big credit to the community college system and the Cal State system for working together on something that just seems to everyone else should have been logical, but it wasn't. It was like, if you're a student going into community college that wants to transfer, let's say to Cal State, you can't even navigate that. You don't even know that you're taking courses that really won't end up being recognized by Cal State to transfer. So that's what the Cal State and Community College with the governors worked on, getting this transfer degree, which is really increasing the rates of transfer and helping students in that regard. UC, however, has not done that yet, and there is a move afoot to try to get UC as well to work out a kind of clearer transfer degree with the community college system. And one other thing I just wanted to clear up, having the privilege of both being part of USC, running Arnold's Institute here, and on the board of regents for UC, I compare and contrast daily our public university issues versus our private university issues. And when Dan and others were talking about international students' higher tuition, just to be clear for policy for this audience, is public universities on policy charge a much lower in-state tuition than out-of-state, not international, but out-of-state. Many students come from international, but it's an out-of-state tuition. And the policy behind that is for our public universities, where state taxpayers are subsidizing and contributing largely to the education, that they felt the public mission of those universities should be mostly to educate high school students from California, from that state. So so having most of your admissions be for the students in your state is part of your public mission. The difficulty has come to Cal State and UC is that as the state's reducing money and making more and more cuts, and you can get way more revenue by increasing the percentage of out-of-state students, be they internationally or whatever, when you don't want to cut, that becomes a very attractive option. So Dan would appreciate this. The real policy question to ask that the UC Board of Regents asked, I'm sure Cal State, and that is, if you're increasing the percentage of out-of-state students, can you do it in a way that the extra revenue actually allows you to also have more slots for in-state students? So that's not automatically taking out-of-state students means you're taking less in-state. It might, but that's a question to be asked.
And we're going to try to work in a couple of other student questions before we wrap up. Other questions? I think there was one up here, if I'm not mistaken.
So, my name is Michele. I'm a USC graduate, but I'm a byproduct of Los Angeles Community College. And my question was somewhat addressed, so I'm going to try to rephrase it quickly. In terms of cost efficiency, in comparison, my sister goes to a Cal State Los Angeles, and she was only able to take very limited amount of units because of overcrowding for general education courses. So has this changed the model of cost efficiency of community college and transfer versus Cal State LA for 6 to 7 years for some students, depending on the passion of their major? And how is the Cal State and UC system addressing these concerns as these lower division courses for high impacted majors have become nearly impossible for students to access while their tuition has remained constant?
Coming from Cal State LA, I can answer that. 5 years ago when I started at Cal State LA, we had 900 incoming freshmen. We were a largely transfer population and about 20% graduate students. This year we have 3,000 incoming freshmen and a much smaller transfer than we had before, but we're still busting at the seams. Because students are seeing that their option to go to community college really isn't that great of an option because they may spend 4 years there. And so I think that's a big reason why a lot more students are coming in as incoming freshmen. But it does change the dynamic on the campus because you're used to providing mostly upper division transfer student education, and now you have a large population of freshmen. Same dollar amount you're getting, but you have to now onboard more courses. And you may have less students sitting in the upper division transfer classes, but you can't just, teach 2/3 of a class and then move 1/3 of it over there. You still have to provide that. So I think as we were taking these big, huge budget cuts, it was an issue because where do you cut? You try to use a phrase that someone once told me, rack 'em, pack 'em, stack 'em. You try to put people in as many classes as you can, and you try to provide access where you can. The problem you get is you get this cap where they tell you can't take more than 17,000 students. Well, you've already admitted them. They're regularly admissible students. They met all the criteria, and you have to let them in, but you only have space for 17,000, and what do you do? And it is difficult, and there are campuses that go over and they get penalized, they get money taken away from them because they're not supposed to go over. So it makes it very difficult. Ethically, for me, it's difficult because I think you should just provide access to all, you let them in, you should provide them all classes, but you don't always have the money to do that, and you have to try to figure out the way to spend your dollar most wisely. So yeah, it has been difficult when you're, especially when you get more people wanting to go there than you have space.
Online education for the courses most in demand that we're not able to meet the needs for the time to completion degree.
Yeah.
I just was going to jump in real quickly. I think Lisa brings up a really good point, which is how do you cut costs in education without hurting the product? It's very difficult to you increase the number of students in a course, you get to a certain point, it's not as valuable an experience for students as it would have been with a smaller amount. So there are a lot of issues involved with, it's easy to say, let's make it more efficient, let's reduce costs, but there are a lot of challenges when the product is at risk.
One question I had, because a lot of our discussion today centered sort of around state policy, one national idea that President Obama brought up, I think, in one of his states of the union, was the idea of ranking colleges based on tuition, debt burden at graduation, and the share of low-income students attending the university. I was wondering, and this is open to anyone on the panel, I was wondering what you guys sort of thought about that, if that's if ranking universities is effective and fair, and if that would have any effect on how spending is prioritized.
So I found that, yes, most financial aid is really just based on the number of students and that are at the university and nothing else. And I think that in theory, this is a really good idea. But one thing that I will say, like, that relates to the K through 12 education policy is an unintended consequence of kind of putting all of the K through 12 schools kind of theoretically on the same platform, was that a lot of states kind of dumbed down their standards so that they could compete and look better for that specific kind of competitive platform. And I personally would be nervous that the similar kind of consequence would occur if you were to suddenly try to put all these colleges on the same platform, because they would start simply focusing on those specific standards rather than the other important standards. So now we can see with a lot of K through 12 education, it's a lot more money is going toward, math and science specifically, since that's where a lot of the funding will go toward. And in addition to that, there's a lot of college standards that, I mean, of course you can't include everything, but there's a lot of college standards that really can't be measured, just kind of like the fit, the culture, things like that, and how should that play a role?
So I'm generally pretty supportive of the idea of a college scorecard, which is what the president has put forward. But I do agree with Taylor's points about, you have to be really thoughtful about the scorecard. What I do think the president has been very clear about, you are only evaluating schools based on similar institutions. And he's also called out a few things that are valuable that sometimes are not seen as valuable by U.S. News and World Report and other ranking systems, right? Around number of Pell Grant students served, around transfer rates, around time to completion. Graduate earnings and advanced degrees is interesting. So, this is just sort of, right now it's actually up for discussion. So the idea is they want to put this rating system scorecard up by 2015, but they're gathering input. And I think that's where it's going to be really important for a lot of us to be at the table and for academics to be at the table, because there are things that you can't measure. But should parents and students actually have transparency of information to get an average of how long it's taking a student to go? If you're a Latino or African American student, what's the likelihood of you actually succeeding if you go to one institution versus another? I think those things are good. I think we deserve to know.
I think if there's one thing that matters to colleges, it's rankings. So maybe not the only thing, but creating a discussion around making affordability one of the criteria by which colleges are evaluated, I think, is very beneficial. And if U.S. News and World Reports were to prioritize or have that as a significant factor, I think you'd see universities and colleges respond.
Well, I just have, the only concern you have with rankings and with scorecards is what people do to make sure that they make it within the scorecard. So one thing that you can do if you're a CSU, your mission is to serve your local students. If your local students aren't as prepared as, say, a student from a different area, then you do declare impaction, and you declare every program impacted, and then you only let in the cream of the crop in every single one of those areas. A lot of the students that we serve are place-bound, especially Latina and some of the Filipina students are not allowed to live anywhere else. They have to live at home, so they're place-bound. So when you put in those impaction criteria like that, you may force people in your local area out of your school, and you'll take more qualified students from outside the area. So that's my concern with the scorecard. It has to be fair and equitable, and it has to take account for those kinds of activities that schools will do to make sure they make it within the scorecard.
One of the other things that President Obama talked about recently when he was discussing higher education is he, I'd say, wondered out loud about the advisability of making law school a 2-year rather than a 3-year program. Now, I devote time every semester to try to convince students not to go to law school, so I think that's just a fine idea. But what struck me about that was less the proposal than the fact that it reflected something that it actually is already taking place, not so much at graduate school, but among undergrads. That given the increased unaffordability of a college education that all 4 of you have talked about, more and more students trying to finish as quickly as possible. In 7 semesters, in 6 semesters, seen students trying to get in and out in 5 semesters, simply to save the additional tuition dollars. So I guess my question to you, it's more of a philosophical one, and anyone who'd like to take a crack at it can. If I can get out of college in 2.5 years and save $150,000 in tuition by doing so, well, that saves me money, and presumably I'm just as ready for my post-college career as ever. But it's also cost me something. It's cost me almost half of what ought to be a very broad, well-rounded college experience. So here's my totally unfair question for the panel. What's a college education for? Is it to prepare a young person for a particular job or particular career upon finishing? Or is it to get that sort of broader and less tangibly identifiable college and academic and educational experience? Which is more important? Goldie's an unfair question.
It is, but you know what? I'll say that I think both. I mean, I think I got a liberal arts education, and I love reading folks that bash liberal arts education, even though actually if you look at sort of business CEOs and the top folks, a lot of them actually got a liberal arts education. So, I mean, I think it has to be to create citizens that are, well-rounded, critical thinkers, communication skills, all those things that are hard to measure, right? But that prepare you for any particular job. But at the end of the day, I mean, did I go to college just to get those things? No. I went to college to get those things in the hope that I would have a job that would bring me out of poverty so I wouldn't have to live paycheck to paycheck like my mom did. So I don't think it's fair to disassociate the two. I think folks want to go to college to be prepared and get a job. Now, if we can do both, and if some people know exactly that they want, here's the program, and so you're not maybe going to have a very broad, rounded curriculum because that's what you know you want to do, then great. We should offer those options, and we do. But to say that it's either or, I don't think is fair.
Told you it wasn't fair. It's not an either or, and it's not an absolute. But if any of the other panelists would like to talk about the mix and the balance involved there, it'd be a terrific way to wind up the conversation.
Well, I personally think it is a balance. I mean, I'm an accountant. That was my first degree, was in accounting, and it's all numbers based. But the 2 courses that I learned the most from were a sculpture class I took at Humboldt State and a philosophy, sex, love, and marriage class that I took at Chico State. And those were all, they were like mind expanding because it brought me out of my box, and I think it really made me a better person. If I was just taking accounting courses, I would have never encountered those classes, and I don't think it would have changed my mindset the way it did. So I think a well-rounded education does provide you something. It makes you a much better thinker, and you're able to take other people's perspectives because, just understanding that there were people out there that didn't have the same thought process as I did about things that were ethical, that to me was just completely mind-blowing. I came from a family, my father was an engineer, my sister's an engineer, and I'm an accountant, so it was very, very analytical type of growing up. So it provides you that extra bit of education that you may not get at home. So I think it's important to have a well-rounded education. And I think the other issue I have is if you try to hurry up and speed up and get out, if you're an engineer, I sure would hope you're not designing bridges for me, because I really want you to understand and learn and spend all your time doing what you need to do.
All right, well, I am happy to have been called out by both of our off-campus guest panelists, because as they correctly pointed out, it's not an either or, but I think they provide a very important reminder to all of us that it's really easy in the middle of those 4 years, or 3.5 or 4.5 years, to get overly focused in one of those two directions or the other, and to remember that it is a balance between the two, is what makes the college education not just affordable, but most rewarding. So let's thank our panelists, not just for calling me out, but more importantly, for a for a fascinating conversation on a critically important issue. Michele Siqueiros, Taylor Wolfson, Lisa Chavez, Megan Baaske, thank you very, very much. Thanks as well to my co-moderator, Daniel Rothberg, and his colleagues at the Daily Trojan for helping us each week. To Bonnie and to Mebus and to their entire team at the Schwarzenegger Institute for working with us all semester long to put these programmings on for you. Thank you both very, very much. And thanks, finally, last but definitely not least, to the team at the Unruh Institute, to Kirsten Olson, to Jody Epstein, to Andrena Hidalgo, to Lucas Servodio, and especially to Laura Hill, as well as our terrific student workers for putting on these programs for us every week. Thank you very, very much. Next Wednesday, our conversation is on the subject of immigration reform. And since everyone in Washington assumes that a comprehensive immigration bill will in fact be passed in the next 6 days, okay, probably not, we'll have quite a bit to talk about. But in addition to next week's discussion on immigration reform, also tomorrow evening, there is an information session for the Teach for America program. And for anyone who is thinking about what they want to do after their 4 years here and thinks that TFA might be an opportunity worth looking into, that program is going to take place in Wade Phillips Hall, room 207, from 6 to 8 p.m. And then finally, as course registration opens for the spring, remember that our Poli-Sci 395 internship class is signing students up, both for traditional internships not only in government offices and in campaign offices, but for issue advocacy and civic engagement opportunities as well. And also remember that the Unruh Institute offers a research-based internship in which you do an on-campus internship researching a real-world problem for a real-world political or government entity. And Jody Epstein and Laura Hill are in our offices in VKC 263 to talk to you about that, whatever you like. Once again, thanks to all of you for coming. Great conversation. Thank you again to our panelists, and we'll hope to see you here again next week.